This man is Dennis Nash, and he was a construction worker. His life had not been easy for him for a while. That week, he and his fellow workers were out of pay because the prospective homeowner's loan application had been denied by the bank. Dennis was a single father, and he had a young son named Connor Nash. The two were at the courthouse for a hearing regarding Dennis's overdue mortgage payments that day. At the end of the trial, the judge ruled that Dennis and his family had to leave the house because the bank already had a new buyer lined up. Disappointed, Dennis left the court.
Family home, Your Honor. I was born and raised in that home. Give me a bit more time, Your Honor,
Bailey,
please.
please remove Mr. Nash.
And we tried to work out a short sale.
Back at their home, Dennis's mother, Lynn Nash, ran a hairdressing business out of the living room, which meant losing the house would be devastating for the entire family. To fight for the home, Dennis had desperately tried to secure free legal counsel, but to no avail. The very next day, a ruthless real estate broker named Rick Carver arrived with a sheriff and a crew of men. When the sheriff knocked on the door, Dennis felt his heart pounding. He didn't know what to do to face Rick. Lynn urged him to face the men and try to explain their situation. However, the moment Dennis opened the door, the sheriff immediately stated that they were there to execute the eviction ordered by the court. The official document signed by the judge was promptly shown. No matter how fiercely Dennis and Lynn pleaded for more time, Rick stood by his ground, demanding they leave the property. Lynn begged for a single day, but the sheriff was firm, granting them a mere 2 minutes to collect their belongings, or they would be arrested. The situation quickly grew more emotional as everyone tried to assert their arguments. Dennis and Lynn were forced to quickly pack important belongings since they were now officially trespassing on someone else's property. They had no choice but to accept the situation.
2 minutes is a courtesy. Let her take the plan. You said that 2 minutes was up.
I'm getting the bills.
Line up, get the locks.
Will you just let her go in and get the...
To make matters worse, Connor arrived home from school just in time for the eviction and couldn't comprehend the disaster right in front of his eyes. Soon enough, their belongings were piled on the front lawn. Rick told them that they had 24 hours to move their things from the yard, or everything would be hauled away and tossed out. The family then relocated to a cramped, single-room motel that was filled with many others who had also been victims of foreclosure and eviction. Dennis, a construction worker, had to start looking for a job immediately, but finding work during that time was incredibly difficult. Lynn suggested that he take them out of town to stay with relatives, but Dennis refused to give up. He was determined to stay in that city so Connor wouldn't have to leave school and lose his friends. One morning, Dennis went to retrieve his missing construction tools, which he suspected Rick's crew had taken on the day they were kicked out of the house. He went to the property to demand his belongings back, but it didn't go as planned, and things got from bad to worse. At that moment, knowing that Dennis was a capable builder, Rick tried to de-escalate the situation by offering him a job and telling him to follow his crew. Dennis was still annoyed that his tools were still missing, but he knew he had no choice but to accept the job. He then went with Ike and his men to a house with a nasty plumbing issue. A sewage leak had caused filth to back up everywhere, making the house absolutely reek. Rick's regular workers refused to take on such a nasty job. Seeing the opportunity, Dennis immediately stepped up, demanding a payment of $250 to be paid in front for the job. Fortunately, Rick agreed to the price. After the agreement, Dennis went inside the house, but he came right back out within a minute, thanks to the nauseating smell. Rick then offered him a drink and asked what kind of work Dennis was capable of. Dennis replied that he could handle almost every aspect of construction work. After calming a bit, Dennis went back inside the house, and with his leadership developed over the years working as a construction worker, he managed to persuade a few other men to help him. Thanks to his skills, he earned his $250 that day, but unfortunately, he couldn't tell his mother and son where the money came from. He lied to them, claiming that he got the job from fellow workers he knew. Some other time, Dennis went to Rick's house where he was tasked with fixing a broken air conditioning unit. Given his experience, the job was a walk in the park for him, and he finished it in no time. Rick then took Dennis with him while explaining what he did for a living and offering Dennis a share of the business. As they drove in the area, Rick happened to notice his neighbor stealing water from one of his foreclosed properties and immediately took action. He called his office and quickly got the neighbor's name. The man was Frank Green. It turned out that Frank was in the same boat as Dennis. His house was due to be seized by the bank in 90 days. Dennis seemed uneasy about Frank's situation, but Rick sternly warned him not to be soft when dealing with people like this. Next, they headed to a large home that Rick planned to sell, so he instructed Dennis to perform the necessary repairs. For this job, he was given a check for $3,250. It was way more than what he used to be paid for his work, and he immediately grew suspicious, worried that such a large sum of money would bring him trouble. Rick, being a businessman he is, assured Dennis about the money. He explained that this was not the government's money, nor dirty, corrupt money. Dennis, wanting nothing more than to earn enough money to buy his home back, agreed to work for Rick. Dennis started his new line of work immediately. His task was visiting houses slated for foreclosure, handing out official notices, and distributing forms that homeowners were required to fill out. As expected, things were never on the smooth side. He often received threats from the frustrated homeowners. Some other time, Dennis and his colleagues were given another assignment from Rick to remove some appliances from the houses being sold so that the bank would have to replace them with brand new units. They would then sell the used goods and split the profits. Feeling that he needed something to defend himself from all the risks, Dennis told Rick that he needed a weapon for self-defense. Rick then gave him a gun and another job. This one was to verify that all bank seized properties were indeed abandoned by their owners. Dennis then recruited his old construction colleagues to help him check the houses on the list. He instructed his friends to fill out official documents, essentially pretending to be tenants in those homes. This way, he and Rick could later offer them a payment to leave the property voluntarily. In essence, Dennis was now working with Rick to use government money and deliberately confuse the banking system. On another occasion, Dennis was working with Rick as usual, counting the cash they had earned from their previous deals. All this time, Dennis had refused to accept the bonus money Rick offered him, instead asking Rick to hold it. He requested that Rick use the accumulated funds and his influence to help him get his old family home back. Rick agreed and committed to helping Dennis repurchase his foreclosed property from the corporation that owned it. He would draft a contract for Dennis, but everything had to wait until the house was processed into the bank system, confirming its status as ready to sell. Until the bank completed the paperwork, Dennis could not officially move in. Nevertheless, Dennis was overjoyed that his family would soon get their home back. Rick then announced that their next task would be an eviction, and the homeowner in question was someone who was putting up a fight. Rick instructed Dennis to ready his gun, stating that he would teach him the ropes so he would eventually get used to the job. Initially, Dennis felt sick about performing the eviction himself, but Rick provided him with a harsh lesson, revealing his own background. He told Dennis that his father was just a construction worker who broke his back for little reward, even once falling off a roof. It was his parents' poor economic state that drove Rick to become more than just an ordinary real estate agent, leading to his dirty methods for making money while stating that the government would never care about the misery of people like them. Motivated by this, Dennis agreed to handle the eviction. Since he had witnessed Rick perform them before, he decided he wanted to do it on his own. The day he did the job, Dennis executed the eviction exactly as Rick had done to him previously.
Dennis Nash, Rick Carver Realty, remember? Your house has been foreclosed on.
Look, we're gonna have to wait till he calls us back. We can't leave today.
No, sir. You and your wife are trespassing. I escort you to jail. It's your choice. Yes.
He experienced tremendous internal conflict. On one hand, he was doing his job, but on the other, he knew exactly how the homeowner felt because he had been through the same thing. He knew the sadness of being kicked out of one's own house. One day, Dennis took his mother and Connor back to their old house. Lynn and Connor were stunned that they could even step foot inside again. Dennis then explained that he had successfully bought their home back. He told them that his boss gave him the money and he would pay him back. However, he was still concealing the truth from his mother, hiding that he was working for Rick. He just informed his mother that they still could not occupy the house yet and had to wait for the final confirmation from the bank. While waiting for the paperwork to be finished, Dennis continued with his eviction work at several homes. The more frequently he performed the job, the more accustomed his heart became to the task. However, one house rattled him. He had to evict an elderly man who lived alone. The old man had nowhere else to go, so the sheriff on the scene had to escort him to social services. Because of his good job in clearing out properties, Rick promoted Dennis to a permanent employee. Dennis started accompanying Rick to important property business meetings. At one of the meetings, someone reported that a large investor was moving into their area and collaborating with a rival broker named Ortiz, a move that could potentially mess with their own business growth. Rick assured his superior that he knew Ortiz and could ensure the investor would steer clear of him and his team. He also guaranteed that they would sell any number of houses his boss wanted. The boss then stated he wanted to sell 1,000 houses, a massive number that promised huge profits. After the meeting, Rick assigned Dennis a new job to follow Ortiz and dig up any information regarding his deal with the investor. For this particular assignment, Dennis would get a lifetime cut of 10% from any additional sales he helped generate. Dennis began spending his days tailing Ortiz, trying to gather the necessary intelligence for Rick. During his surveillance, he spotted Frank and his family and decided to check in on him. However, he was not welcomed kindly because Frank knew he was working for Rick. Frank claimed he was ready to fight the foreclosure with a top-notch lawyer who was assisting him for free, and he was confident he would win in court. Dennis was then asked to leave. Sometime later, Rick and Dennis discussed the possibility of losing the market share because Ortiz appeared to be on the verge of selling hundreds of houses at various locations. Dennis, however, hatched a cunning plan. He proposed to remove the air conditioners, water pumps, and kitchen equipment from those homes that Ortiz was about to sell. Rick immediately realized the potential. The investor would likely call off the deal, canceling the partnership with Ortiz. Rick could then contact the bank directly. Their plan started, and it worked perfectly. The bank later reported that the investor had indeed canceled the agreement with Ortiz, while mentioning the numerous missing AC units, water pumps, and kitchen appliances. The investor suspected that Ortiz was taking profits by taking the items. Rick suddenly offered a counter-proposal, offering that he and Dennis would install all those missing items, but the entirety of Ortiz's deal with the investor was transferred to them instead. The bank had no choice and agreed. With that agreement secured, they celebrated the massive success with a party. One afternoon on Connor's birthday, they held a small celebration at the motel, and Dennis gave Connor a new bicycle. At that moment, while playing outside, Dennis spotted a family arriving at the motel. This family turned out to be one of his recent eviction victims, and the father recognized Dennis's face and name immediately. The man began shouting, claiming that Dennis was the one who had thrown him out of his house. All the other residents of the motel heard the commotion and finally realized that Dennis was working for Rick. Dennis kept trying to deny that he knew the man, but he eventually became overwhelmed with emotion and accidentally blurted out the truth. This whole incident was obviously dangerous for Dennis and his family. The motel residents were mostly victims of foreclosure, and Dennis was the one responsible for many of those evictions. Lynn angrily confronted him, but Dennis continued to lie, claiming that he only repaired foreclosed houses and never knew any of the people who had accused him before. Dennis eventually went outside to defuse the situation. The next day, he gathered Lynn and Connor Nash, taking all their belongings to move them out of the motel, as it was no longer safe. Since Dennis's old home still couldn't be occupied, he instead purchased a different house, a much larger one with a swimming pool out back. However, his mother was not happy with his decision. She refused to live in a house bought with money earned from Rick, and she despised that Dennis was making a living by throwing people out of their homes. The next day, Rick called Dennis to meet at the main office. They had received information that Frank was attempting to overturn his eviction in court. If Frank succeeded, others would surely follow, causing the new investor to back out of their major deal. So Rick gave Dennis a critical task to deliver an official publication notice to the court, a piece of evidence that would legally incriminate Frank and cause him to lose his case. Dennis believed this was outright fraud, but Rick managed to persuade him, claiming it was merely a piece of paperwork that had been forgotten. Dennis was now facing a severe moral dilemma, whether to hand over the fraudulent evidence or not. As the time for the court hearing approached, Dennis was about to walk out, but one of Rick's men approached him and took the evidence. Dennis then watched the proceedings and saw Frank lose the case in front of his wife and child. The rough day for Dennis was far from over. When he arrived at his new house later that day, he discovered that his mother and son had left town and moved in with relatives. Consumed by frustration, Dennis felt that all his hard work had been pointless. The next day, Rick picked up Dennis for the eviction of Frank from his home. Upon arrival, the situation was extremely tense. Frank refused to come out, threatening to shoot the police if they dared to enter his property. Frank shouted that he should have won in court, but he lost in the final minutes due to some piece of evidence that appeared from nowhere. Frank was distraught, feeling utterly betrayed by the judge and the system.
Put the gun down. Put the gun, sir. Put the weapon down.
Trespassing! My wife and kids are in this house!
Get your gun.
I am not gonna leave here! Put it down now!
Not gonna happen,
Put
sir.
it down! No proof of publication filed. Fact!
Dennis!
Get the fuck off! Dennis!
Dennis decided to try to talk Frank down. Eventually, he confessed that he was the one who cheated Frank by delivering the false document to the courthouse on the day of the hearing. Thanks to Dennis's confession, Frank softened. He realized that Dennis's admission could potentially help him fight to keep his home. Frank then surrendered, and Dennis was immediately detained by the police for questioning regarding his revelation. Frank was immensely disappointed in Dennis, who now faced the possibility of imprisonment and losing everything. Rick, on the other hand, with all his money and connections, would undoubtedly walk away free, even if Dennis tried to drag him down with him. What Dennis did was a huge risk that would ruin his future, but in that moment, he chose to use his conscience to help Frank and his family remain in their home.
In the hallway's cold and hollow gleam, a silent scream, a shattered dream. Books and fists, their laughter stings, a fragile heart bound by their strings. At home the echoes louder still, a crueler world that breaks the will. Family faces etched with pain, in shadows deep the tears remain. But even glass, when pressure grows, cuts sharper than the winter's